No mai hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi ne kodangri tōku ingoa. All eyes across the ditch on this episode. Australia has been really busy, especially in the media regulation front, and in a kind of quite a chilling contrast to our own governments. Basically, despite fears that Trump's tariffs might spell the end of that sort of muscular response to big tech that they've seen, 2025 has been a year of profound change in the regulatory landscape for Australian media. There's the social media ban for under 16s, which goes live next week as we record. There are new local content spending rules for the big paid streaming platforms, and there's a revised version of the news bargaining code, which aims squarely at Meta, which had previously been able to kind of wriggle off the hook. As I said, you would think that would provide a blueprint for our government, but that does feel altogether too ambitious at this point in the electoral cycle. Regardless, Tim Burrows has been covering all this at Umbrella and rejoins The Fold to update us on what our near neighbour has been up to. Tēnā koe, Tim. Welcome back to The Fold.
Hey, Duncan. Oh, God, you're already starting on a bit of a down note. You sound a bit defeated about your local policy already.
I mean, honestly, it just feels like there is just a great big nothing there. The theory of it is that we're going to watch Australia and kind of start to mirror that legislation, but the practice seems to be that we're going to watch Australia and then have an election, and then maybe a year after that we'll consider whether to do something, by which time, in all likelihood, the goalposts have moved again, and that's just the vibe I'm getting. But maybe what you're doing will be a raging success, and prompt a reconsideration of that non-strategy over here.
Well, it's funny as well, because we sit here complaining how long the government takes to join the dots from the moment of announcing a policy to enacting it. So,
oh my God, careful what you wish for. Come over here to see how slow can be. Let's start off with the social media ban for under 16s. That's been watched and kind of discussed globally, and it's now a little over a week away from actually being sort of flicked on. How smooth or rough has it been in terms of the support or resistance over the past year for that particular policy?
Yeah, so December 10th is finally coming on fast. For a long time, it seemed like a long way away, and there've been various kind of criticisms along the way on the clarity with which the Australian government has given or not given to the platform. So one of the kind of interesting things about the legislation is it doesn't prescribe how they implement the ban. They make it the problem of the platforms, which I think is, at this stage, is politically smart. We'll see when we get to the other side and someone's accused of breaching it, whether it's as smart when there aren't specific rules. But broadly, what we've seen are the platforms as they kind of prepare for it. Most of them are intending to use sort of usage signals rather than that crude thing of you must register and you must prove your age. So for the most part, they're taking those sort of signals of, hey, if you've been on the platform for 10 or 15 years, then I think we can probably assume that you're over the age of 16. And if all of your friends and connections that you talk to are, in a similar pattern. So there's a lot of sort of deduction going on from the platform. So that's been sort of one element to it, which is, smooth or not, depending how you look at it. And the other is just the clarity of which platforms are covered and which are not. So we had a great deal of controversy early on when YouTube was initially not covered. And it kind of appeared that was as a result of some lobbying by their owner Google. Then they were covered. There've been arguments from various other platforms that they're not really a social network; they're an entertainment platform. TikTok comes to mind. And then there are the ones being left out, and we're up to, I think it's 9 platforms now covered, but as we record, Roblox not yet, and that's become increasingly hard to defend. I think it almost feels like because it unless one happens to either be a kid or have a kid, one probably hasn't, used Roblox. So therefore, I think it escaped the radar of a lot of politicians thus far, at least.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting one, right? But it's almost invisible to over 16s and of consuming interest to under 16s, but because no one's on it, that's in that kind of in a voting block, they don't really even know what it is. So in terms of the practicalities of it, you say there's a sort of a signal-based response, which inevitably is going to mean there are a number of people who are over 16 who just look like they're under 16, and so is there like a process, like a court of appeals, and how will they deal with the what are likely to be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who feel like they're on the wrong side of it for one reason or another?
Well, again, yeah, this is one of those fascinating things that it will be for each platform to run their own, let's call it, appeals system. And there is an expectation that they will deal with it, and that's set down in the law, but the law doesn't set out how. So I think the presumption would be then some sort of upload of a form of ID, presumably, and then of course you open up all of those risks around leakage of that data. Let's call it inevitable leakage of that data in the future. Yeah,
it does. And how does the platform go about proving that this is a legitimate form of ID, and on down the chain? In terms of this was, of all of the policies we're about to discuss, comfortably the most popular, it felt like, in terms of the electorate, and there weren't many in Parliament who, on either side of the aisle, who were sort of mounting a full-throated condemnation of it. Is that remained broadly in place? I know there have been some like civil society groups and others who've kind of voiced opposition to it, but it still feels like quite a popular policy. And I should say that it's the only one which feels like it has any momentum in New Zealand. There's a big campaign about it and starting to be support from government too.
Yeah, I think that is a pretty good summary. Once it began to get up the political head of steam, sort of, led by the Labour government, certainly the coalition as the opposition didn't stand against it, and neither of any of the other main parties. We've seen rumblings of court actions by one or two under 16s, which may yet get some sort of legal hearing. Now that is unlikely to happen this side of the legislation kicking in, though. So that feels like perhaps that will be more of a 2026 story. But I think you're right that broadly this was something which has been politically popular. And hasn't actually hit too many roadblocks.
I mean, thinking about the practicalities of it, a lot of YouTube. I think this is less true, but still sometimes true for Instagram and TikTok too. That usage can happen without being logged in, and you can still get, particularly with YouTube, access to effectively, if not the whole platform, then a huge amount of it. How will the kind of non-logged in user be sort of dealt with, and how sincere do you feel like big tech is more broadly in terms of compliance versus opening leakage doorways to the side kind of thing?
Do you know what? Sort of in kind of private briefings, I won't say which ones, but where I've had that sort of message from the platforms, they have certainly wanted to get across the message that they've got their reservations about how it will work in practical terms. They certainly don't like the principle, but they're very keen to get the message across that they're going to do everything possible to comply with it. So they're going to use their best endeavours rather than sort of do some version of go slow. And I suspect that at least part of it, and I think this comes from the government will probably see this way as well. Some of this it's about giving parents license or symbolism to say to kids, well, it's the law, you shouldn't be on it. So it's another weapon in the parental armoury, rather than something that, every loophole can be stopped, because, clearly, any kid will know how to use a VPN, for instance, to skirt around this stuff. So an awful lot of it, I think, is it gives the parents an extra symbolism, rather than something which is going to be 100% a technological solution.
And thinking about the sort of other side of it, this was, I think, my reading of the argument that it was made because on the basis that there were fears of harms to children, that unavoidably there are winners out of it, and that's largely, other places that under 16s can get entertainment type programming or
newspapers are back, baby.
The newspapers are all the way back. That kids page, the cartoons page, is going to be huge. Who are the perceived winners, and how is the sort of potential impact being kind of seen on those who've previously had audience disappear, who might potentially hope for it to come back?
Yeah, do you know, that is in terms of perceived winners, that is a tricky one, because effectively, we're talking about platforms not yet designated, but and that's in the power of the Safety Commissioner. But of course, the issue with that is any platform which gets a degree of success as a result will probably then reach the attention and in turn be designated. Now, you could once have made the argument, well, let's think about Australia's commercial TV networks, for a slightly larger share of attention. But of course, they successfully lobbied some years ago now to remove all of their obligations around children's programming. So it's not as if there are any kids watching free-to-air television anymore. So I don't know. I mean, I suspect that maybe the number of minutes of media that kids will absorb will fall away, or give it another 2 years, and I suspect that the time will be absorbed in voice chatting to AI, and I'm not even joking about that.
No, it could be, though. You would expect potentially some kind of uplift in usage for like a Disney Plus or a Netflix, potentially marginal subscriber growth. There. But I guess that's the whole point of it, is on some level it's a giant experiment in what happens when you pull away the most popular platforms from such a big cohort.
Yeah, and I do like the point of view that, I remember asking this question of my stepdaughter, who would have been about 14 or 15 at the time, how would you feel about losing a social media platform? And so long as her friends lost it at the same time, so she wasn't missing out from contact with her friends, wouldn't care at all, would actually be quite glad.
Honestly, I've asked the same question to my kids and had the exact same response. It's almost like they're not beloved, but they are mandatory, effectively. So, well, we will see and potentially check in again next year sometime. Let's talk about the screen quotas now, which again have been passed into law very recently. What do they involve, and who was pushing for it?
Yeah, so that finally passed into law in late November in Australia, and effectively that's a policy that's been pretty much 3 years in the making. So the Australian government had a kind of policy for the arts sector called Revive, of which one element was effectively creating quotas for the platforms, which was similar, at least I suppose, as a sort of principle to the quotas that the free-to-air commercial players have had for decades. The difference being, rather than based on the number of kind of hours a week, based on and the platforms will have a choice, but based on either profits or the amount spent on content overall, which is kind of clever, because one of the ways that the platforms reduce the amount of tax they have to pay locally is they offshore an awful lot of their costs as paying the parent company for the content. So it creates a kind of new framework, which, kind of umbrella, my colleague Hal Crawford did the calculation and reckoned that probably it's going to mean about 150 million Australian dollars at least into the kind of the screen production industry ecosystem, which I think for the independent production sector is quite good news. And for the free-to-air networks, they tend to view it as bad news because they're now competing with the platforms when it comes to paying for content, paying for people's time, all of those things. So it's actually created a bit of an extra competitive element for them.
It's interesting because they typically are powerful and often successful lobbyists themselves, but in this case it sounds like the argument from the screen production sector beat out the argument from the the sort of the networks. How does it relate to the likes of Stan, where you've got a sort of a domestic streamer effectively, but it's also attached to a large free-to-air or domestic television business itself?
Yeah, you're right. So Stan, owned by Nine. Now, I suspect that similar to Paramount Plus, which is aligned with Network 10, which is one of the other free-to-air players here, I suspect that they will be easily able to jump over the hurdle because, of course, they can choose to commission in whichever direction they want to, make it first run on the streamer before it runs on the free to air, which is often what seems to happen anyway. So I suspect for those players, it will be fairly easy to kind of tick the box on that minimum spend. And it will probably be a bit more of a challenge for the likes of, your Netflix or your Disney Pluses, etc.
How vigorously did they resist it, the big international streamers? Was it kind of a really combustible battle, or was there a sort of a sense that that it was coming and you're better to get along with it rather than fight them in the streets over it?
Do you know, I think we may not have yet seen the end of the battle because, of course, almost all of these platforms that we're talking about are US based. A lot of them do appear to have the ear of the Trump government. So I wouldn't be surprised if the major lobbying is actually happening in the US rather than with the government locally here. So I do wonder whether there's another shoe to drop yet when it comes to the policy. So we'll see, but certainly it made it to kind of legislation. Once the government finally moved on it, it was a matter of, having sat on the policy for a couple of years, when they finally moved, it was a matter of weeks to race through, which did remind me a little bit of when in the US the legislation to ban TikTok from the US, which obviously proved not to happen, but when that legislation was created, it went from policy to passing in a matter of days. Wasn't that much longer here, but I do have a sense that we'll yet see some sort of counter move coming out of the US.
Because it's interesting, right, that you can sort of see from the streamer's point of view, there's two elements to it. One is, they don't want to be told what to do, and they don't like to have costs imposed upon them anywhere outside of those that they choose to incur themselves. They don't like to pay tax. There's a whole lot of things they don't like to do. Equally, though, countries aren't completely powerless in this situation, even if there is lobbying that goes on, in the sense that, Australian consumers, like a lot of consumers, can be quite nationalist at times, and if it's perceived and widely known that there is this aggressive lobbying of what is internationally a very unpopular administration in Trump's, you can imagine that might be bad for local business. So you kind of have to pick your poison to some extent. But it is interesting that the year started with the announcement of tariffs and a strong sense that they would be used as a weapon against anyone who tried to tax, regulate, or do anything that any American company operating in another country did that company didn't like. Yeah, and that sort of seemed to pause a lot of different work streams that then sort of picked up, particularly in Australia and in the media space in recent months. And there was almost, I read some of the reporting around it that suggested there was a sort of a tacit understanding that whether it was rare earths or, AI data centers or some kind of deal had been struck that said, you can do a little bit of media work here and we'll be given, and we'll allow it as long as you don't mess with these, these other things that matter to us. So what you're suggesting is that might not be wholly accurate, or we just don't know yet?
Well, I think we don't know, but yeah, I like yourself, I definitely recognised a change of tone that came at about the same time it appeared to dawn on the US that China had a pretty good hold on rare earth mining, or for to a large extent, and Australia is one of the few places that might be a kind of alternative source of rare earths. So it all came just ahead of Anthony Albanese's visit to the US, and what had been expected to be a slightly confrontational meeting potentially was a lot warmer. Now, I think it may have just been, very good luck for him that the rare earth stuff all blew up about that time, but it definitely, I'm sure acted as a little reminder to the US administration that there are certain things they do need Australia for. So it could have tempered it, but if everything we read about Donald Trump is true, though, it's sort of like whoever gets in his ear last tends to be the one who wins. And there's been plenty of reporting that Mark Zuckerberg has bought himself a house in Washington and bases himself there and is a regular visitor to the Oval Office. So I suspect that goes for a few of the platforms having Trump's ear. So we'll see, but it does feel to me like there will be a twist and turn along the way.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And when we're talking about the screen quotas, for example, those companies are typically smaller than and less sort of American muscle kind of interesting to Trump than, for example, the social and search, the sort of multi-trillion-dollar companies versus the kind of tiny little tens of billions of dollar companies, with the possible exception of the sort of Skydance Paramount thing because of its connection to Oracle and potentially TikTok. So each one almost has its own, and some of them are perceived negatively because they're news media and there's a kind of perception of bias against it. So it's such a complex and crony-ish kind of a story that trying to say, well, here's a rubric through which you can understand this administration is, you very quickly see the error of that. The last piece of legislation, which we haven't yet talked about, is the News Bargaining Code. It was also the first cab off the rank in 2021, I think.
Correct.
And it's had a chance to be feted and do a lot of stuff and then be kind of start to fall apart, and it's effectively getting a 2.0 version now. Do you want to talk us through briefly what it was and why it is considered in need of overhaul now?
Yeah, so the original policy, the News Media Bargaining Code, which was a policy of the previous coalition government, that effectively said that the big platforms, and at the time that really meant, well, gosh, Facebook was still called Facebook then rather than Meta, but Facebook/Meta and Google/Alphabet were the two platforms being targeted. And it said that they could, under this law, be designated by the government, and if they were designated, and by the way, they never were, but if they were designated, that would mean they would be forced into mandatory bargaining with any core news publisher who appeared on a list kept by the Australian Communications and Media Authority. So you had to kind of satisfy the ACMA that you were a core news provider. And then if you made it onto that list, you could knock on the door of a designated platform and say, I would now like to negotiate with you about how much you pay for for the right to link to my content. And the system was going to be then a kind of mandatory system of bargaining where they would have to bargain and both sides would make an offer, and then the arbitrator wouldn't come up with an answer. They would choose between those two offers. So it created a fair bit of sort of peril, I suppose, or potential peril. Google and Facebook decided that far better to give in to this, what was effectively standover tactics, and go and do enough deals with local news publishers to apparently, pay for the rights to, feature their content in the Google Showcase or in, the Facebook News tab when that existed, all of those things, so that they had a face-saving way of saying, no, we're just buying this content on commercial terms. And the government at the time accepted that enough of these deals have been done that it would choose not to designate those two platforms. Fast forward 3 years, and as far as we can tell, all of the Facebook deals were 3 years long and all of the Google ones 4 years. Facebook, by then a new government, just basically said, we're not going to go again, and effectively dared the Albanese government to do something about that. That was 2 years ago, and it took that long for something to happen. So about 1 year ago, the Australian government, in fact, it was just before Christmas last year, so we are approaching the 1 year anniversary. The Australian government announced this new policy, which was the news bargaining incentive. And effectively, this created and the word was not as politically loaded at that point, but a tariff or a levy on digital advertising, local digital advertising. So in principle, the way it works is search and social platforms above a big size will have a choice. They can either pay a certain percentage of their digital revenues to the Australian government. Now, the government says that's not the outcome they want. What they would prefer are for these platforms to do enough local deals, again, with local news players, and effectively each local deal they do will get them a little bit of a discount on that levy they would otherwise have to pay. So the idea being, this isn't about whether, for instance, Facebook is or isn't a news player, which was sort of how they were getting around the original version of the code. Was they were saying, well, if we have a negotiation, the answer is 0 because we don't have any news media, any news content. So the bargaining incentive effectively is going to attempt to be a mechanism to say to the platforms, you might as well go and do some deal with some media owners, because that's going to be the price of doing business in Australia. So if you want to do business in Australia, that's going to be the cheapest way of doing it. And I mean, that we're now in finally the kind of the position paper on this only having been released in mid-November. We've got until mid-December for the consultation on that. So I think there are still some potential holes in the policy, but at least we're a long way from legislation, but at least there's a policy.
With the previous version, as well as there being kind of holes where the likes of Facebook could get out of the sort of intended focus on them, there was also a critique, I think, from a lot of small publishers that they just, that once the Facebook /Meta and Google felt like they'd signed enough deals, they just sort of stopped doing new ones. Is there an attempt to solve for that kind of concentrating effect? And there was also a critique that, that it didn't necessarily make the, more news be produced. It just kind of, either staved off some layoffs or fattened margins. There wasn't a direct correlation between the payments and the intended outcome. Have either of those critiques been addressed in this round?
Yeah, two very legitimate criticisms. Yeah, firstly, the one on size, and it was exactly that. Is if a small player didn't get to do a deal with the platforms, then they were now finding it twice as hard because they were having to compete with platforms that they were having to compete with other publishers who maybe did have more funding when it came to paying salaries or all of those things. And then, as you say, the other kind of criticism was there was no direct linkage to journalism jobs. So I spin a few plates. So as well as being publisher of Mumbrella and Unmade, I've been this year presenting for the ABC, a show called Medialand, and we had as a guest on that Chris Jans, who had formerly been the head of publishing for Nine locally, and was also involved in helping advising some New Zealand publishers at one point as well. In
I should say, including us with our deal by way of declaration.
Oh, well, there you go. So Chris obviously knew it well, and he kind of conceded fairly openly and in a kind of interview with us on Medialand that the money mainly went to paying down debt and paying shareholders. It didn't directly guarantee any journalism jobs. Now, so far in the policy as published, those two criticisms aren't really answered. Now it'll be very interesting to see because, I'm sure in that consultation period, people will raise that point, and then we will see whether the government amends or thinks about the mechanism to address that.
I mean, broadly characterising the approach made by Google and Meta respectively, Google feels like it grumbles and it will kind of lay out what it views as a principled objection, and will even kind of talk about what it would do if it did that in a local context as recently as last year. But Meta feels like it fights harder and dirtier with these things. Has there been a strong sense from either of the sort of dominant players about how they would respond to this?
Yeah, I would have agreed with that characterisation until maybe a few months back. It began to strike me, certainly in terms of actions, that maybe Google wasn't quite as cuddly as it had previously been. There was there have been a couple of threats to kind of go legal around some of this from the Google side of things. At the point at which when it was announced that YouTube would be included in the age gating legislation, the very next day, YouTube had been due to do a kind of a showcase at Parliament for parliamentarians and their families, and they cancelled it on the day, and that began to look like a little bit of a fit of pique. So I think in the end, platforms are platforms, aren't they? And they've got their shareholders. So whatever their strategy of being, kind of nice or not, they in the end do kind of, I guess, devolve to their own kind of their own self-interest. And you'll have met the same people I have, I'm sure, which is you meet the individuals from the platforms and they're all very nice people. They're representing their corporate overlords, but on a local basis, they're very pleasant people to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, because they view all these countries as potential, it's very domino theory from the 60s all over again, that no matter what they might think is fair in one jurisdiction, they have to imagine it globally and imagine that the fronts might move again. So I sort of have some sympathy for them, while also thinking that government's got to do something. Just before I let you go, does this feel like the end of these kind of big pieces of work? And, that's 3 fairly major pieces of legislation, or is there anything else brewing on the horizon that will impact media?
Yeah, I mean, I'd answer that in a couple of ways. One of which is Australia's ad market is still really challenged. A lot of the advertising funded kind of traditional media businesses have issued profit warnings in recent weeks. The market has gone south very quickly. As we're recording this, Guideline SMI, which tracks agency advertising spend in Australia, they put out their numbers for October, and I think it's the first time that every single medium without exception has a negative number in front of it year on year for the month of October. And that and it comes with the caveat that sometimes SMI later upgrades its numbers. But, some of those numbers are shocking, for news publishing digital, down 40% year on year compared to the same month before. That's the worst of it. But magazines down, again, digital faring slightly worse than in print, but down 35%. So we're definitely, one of those themes is, media is still having, quite a tough time of it. But I think when it comes to kind of digital and platform policy, one of the really imminent decisions for the government is the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, has had a really influential, well-informed division which worked on this kind of 5-year inquiry into the power of the platforms and produced a whole number of really intelligent reports. And the funding for that is due to run out at the end of this year, which would be a real shame if that division was disbanded, because the policy was the policy and the level of information that came out of that division for a governmental organisation was just really impressive, and it would be a real shame to see that go.
Yeah, it did feel like a lot of the mandate for doing something came out of the sort of research and framing that the ACCC put together. So, yeah, that would be a massive loss, you'd think, if that time-bound funding were to just disappear. Lastly, can you... how can our listeners keep up with you? Because I find both your writing and your podcast analysis of Australia's media to be completely peerless. Just to tell them how they can get more Tim Burrows in their lives.
Oh, you are very kind. Well, I think last time we spoke, the main part of my day job was with Unmade, which was on Substack. Since then, I've sort of rejoined the fold of Mumbrella, which was something I was originally part of the team that started that back in 2008. So, Unmade and Mumbrella now sort of live together, and our key way of publishing is out of the Mumbrella publishing stack rather than Substack. So, as good a place to start is probably just at mumbrella.com.au, and we head off like baubles from the Christmas tree from there.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for making time, Tim. And yeah, I'm sure we'll check in. There's so much coming out of Australia, and just to check in with how these legislative streams go, and praying that at some point our government might decide to kind of have a swing at something too. But yeah, thanks so much.
Hey, thank you so much for the invitation. Always a pleasure and never a chore.